In the world of firefighting and public safety, reliability is key. That's why for over 2 decades, first responders nationwide have trusted the FireStore as their go-to source for essential equipment, apparel, and accessories. Visit thefirestore.com online or in-store today.
For all your medication and narcotic tracking needs, check out the LogRX app, created by career fire and EMS professionals. That's LOGRX.com.
This podcast is brought to you by Flex 7 from TenCate Protective Fabrics. Flexible, comfortable, and powered with the strength of enforced technology. Flex 7 outer shell fabric is made to move. To learn more, visit tencatefabrics.com/Flex 7.
Well, welcome to another edition of Fire and Training. I'm your host, Douglas Cline, and joining me tonight is my good friend and esteemed colleague, Christopher Naum out of New York. And we've got a good show for you tonight. It's a little off topic from what we normally talk about when we talk about fire, but we're going to be talking about something that's really relevant and probably timely, following up on some of the natural disasters that we've had across the United States in the last probably 45 days. So, Chris, welcome on the show.
Nice to see you, Doug. How's everything going down there in South Carolina? Doing good?
It's doing well. The upstate's recovering from the Hurricane Helene and the big storm that was in front of Hurricane Helene that dumped a lot of water on them in the upstate and the Tennessee area and North Carolina. But everything's kind of getting back together. It's actually cooled off a little bit. We were in the upper 40s this morning when I went out the door, and kind of felt like I was in New York for a while. And of course, it was tough coming back, from a small trip into the sunny South into Florida. But everything's good. Everything's doing really good.
Well, it's certainly timely when you talk about the topic. I know that when you first presented the topic for discussion for the program, it certainly reflects everything that's been going on over the last number of months with the volatility of weather and the impact when we talk about the built environment on many response areas. And it's not only what we've seen, certainly over the summer months and into the fall, but it's certainly safe to say that as we start moving into the winter months here across the United States, we're going to continue to see some of the challenges with other related weather issues affecting many jurisdictions and response areas.
Well, absolutely we are. And let's kind of talk about what we're diving into is what we discussed, and the idea we got is talking about the built environment and the impacts that it sustains from weather style events. And we've seen hurricanes, we've seen flooding, we've seen tornadoes. We're actually beginning to see snowfall across the United States in different areas. I know New Mexico had a good little dump of snow. Colorado's had a little bit. I was looking at the weather just a little bit ago. There's up to about 8 or 9 inches of snow that could fall in the upper portion of West Virginia in the Panhandle area up around Canaan Valley. I know the ski resorts are really excited about some of that, kind of getting things kicked off coming into the holiday season. But again, part of what we saw from these devastating events from Hurricane Helene, from the winds and the storm surges all the way up to the flash flooding that occurred in the mountains of South Carolina, North Carolina, Tennessee, and of course across the Midwest tornadoes, the impact that this type of system or weather has upon our buildings. And we have to stop and think that we're responding to all these events. Over the time period, we've talked a lot about our different types of construction in many of our series and our programs, some of the impacts that has, some of the thought process, but we've always related it to fire events. We've never really went into anything about, earthquakes or flooding or tornadoes or hurricanes that's really hit that. And today there's actually seismic activity up around the Columbia, South Carolina area as well. So let's talk about that. And what's your thoughts? You're the building construction guy, and you talk about the built environment all the time. And, the big thing that we know is that it does have an impact, how the building's built and the construction features and all the elements up against weather that we're dealing with?
Well, I think first and foremost, when we talk about the geographical uniqueness across the United States from east to west, north to south, over 100 years now, all of our codes as they've been developed, and certainly as we look at our model building codes currently, they all have been designed to relate back to the potential environmental impacts. Those things that are more common, I think it's safe to say, especially as I lead into the conversation, the commonality, the things that are consistent for a geographical area, whether it be rain or weather-induced conditions in the southeast, whether it be snow-related induced conditions in the northeast, or seismic conditions in the west. I mean, everything from the built environment and the codes that developed from the early 1900s till now, which are inclusive of the model building codes, all were designed and developed to include the environmental impacts of day-to-day types of conditions. And they've all been pretty good in terms of the degree of robustness, the accuracy of some things. But I think one of the critical elements that we recognize, especially coming out of the hurricanes and some of the tornadoes, but I think predominantly in the southeast and especially in the Florida area, the predominance of severe weather, which again have been more uncommon in the early part of the 2000 era to what is now becoming more common. We did see some significant changes, both I think Hurricane Hugo back in the 1980s, whether we talk about the southeast as well as into the Florida area, we saw that at that time the codes were not robust enough, and significant changes were implemented to strengthen the codes, which ultimately strengthened and hardened the built environment. So I think that we've learned, based upon these uncommon occurrences that are now becoming more common, we have to stay on top of where building conditions and technology and methods and materials are all affecting our buildings, but more importantly, what are the unusual circumstances, especially relative to the climate changes across the globe, but certainly here in North America, how they're impacting and the lessons and learning. So it's safe to say that we have a lot of trust in our buildings, but it's also safe to say from what we've seen as emergency responders that our buildings are not able to withstand some of those impacts across the variety of things that you just talked about, from snow loads to hurricane to tornadoes to seismic to all of the other related conditions. Even when we talk about wildland conditions and wind-related aspects, there's so many variations, and we're also seeing some of the challenges on a regional and localized basis that our buildings are not able to withstand those types of assaults, which affect our and the civilian survivability. They're just not able to take the brunt of that assault.
You know, one of the conversations that I've had many times, I guess, over the last probably month following Hurricane Helene is the flooding. You know, people have a hard time understanding that level of devastation off of flooding, especially if they're not from a mountainous region. And the way that I explain it is we can take those same buildings here and our flooding goes horizontal. Whereas in mountainous regions, and they go down the valleys or the hollows and those things, it goes vertical. And the intensity of how that moves, the velocity, or better known as hydrology, how it moves is more significant in the mountains than it is when it's just, expanding outward. And I think that's a hard thing for folks to understand. And part of what I wanted to hit on a little bit tonight too, Chris, is out of those floodings, and that's a lot of the conversations that people are giving me, a lot of the questions that I'm getting is how did it do this much damage to some of the buildings and some of the buildings it didn't do damage to? Well, a lot of that does come back to, especially in the flooding activities, the type of building construction. And the buildings that we see that sustained without much of an impact other than debris and mud and those type of elements from flooding were the type 1s and the type 2s. We saw those. Yeah. And it comes back to the commonality of what we talk about for, fire and how it's got resiliency to the fire. But where we saw a lot of the damage and the majority of that was in our type 5 construction. And even in like Chimney Rock and some of those places, we saw type 3 and type 4 construction have issues. But most of your type 4 construction was the real old construction that wasn't I guess, as well built or had degraded itself in there. But most of what they're seeing are all type 5 constructions or type 3 constructions, your ordinary construction that was, really impacted. But the majority was the type 5s. And it just doesn't have the ability or the strength to withstand the hydrology or the forces behind the nature of the water moving through there. And that's a big piece. But that also impacts our operations. So let's talk a little bit about operations when we come to these type of disasters, especially when we get collapse. So we know that in those situations, collapse can occur from either collapsing when it strikes something because it's being moved down a stream, or the collapse occurs because of the structure failing. And how do you operate in those environments, even post the flood, when we're getting rescue companies that are in there? And again, there was, 3-4 days before rescue companies were actually getting to some areas because of how, destructed the infrastructure was, how tore up it was to even get there. And I think about Bakersville, North Carolina, for one. It was like day 4 or 5 or something like that when the Oklahoma City task force actually made it to the town. So let's talk a little bit about that.
I think when you talk about the various type response units, so we talk about task force response, we talk about the typing of those deployments, both the initial and then the full team responses. There's a lot of challenges in terms of even accessing the immediacy of the affected areas. So whether we talk about the receding water based upon storm surges in low-lying areas, whether it be the lowlands of the Carolinas, or we talk about the areas within Florida, we have conditions that are such that inundate an area, whether it be water and or debris or mud, which typically will recede, that provides some degree of accessibility. I think it's safe to say what we have seen and the lessons and learnings have yet to even be captured, but especially when we talk about some of the conditions affecting areas such as the North Carolina region in the western part of the state that was so heavily inundated with water that created a variety of circumstances that no one expected. I certainly, upon watching those events over the last number of weeks and certainly into the months now, was really taken back by the degree of devastation where entire, city areas or communities, the towns, the villages, the hamlets, and so forth, as well as some of the other more metropolitan areas in that region, were so devastated by the mudslides and the debris piles. So when we have some of the waterways, and especially with the rivers, that become so inundated with such a large amount of water inundation, and that once that water starts moving, we have a couple of things that takes into account. We have the movement and the force that becomes multiplied, coupled with all of the debris, which is natural made debris. So we've got trees, rocks, boulders that are the size of freight cars, coupled with the buildings, the built environment areas that they now are overtaking. And then suddenly we have all of this additional material. And the majority of the material is, as you just described, when we talk about type 3 brick and joist construction, type 5 residentials and commercials and so forth, they are all constructed with very small components. So individual components of 2x4s, individual bricks, these all end up disintegrating and resulting in a massive amount of intermixed debris, which, coupled with water, coupled with mud, and especially in those particular areas, creates a very, very challenging degree of circumstances to even access and even identify, especially once that all starts settling down into the feet upon feet upon feet of stratification of mud, debris, rocks, and building materials and furnishings and everything else in between, creates for a very, very challenging accessibility point to access a particularly affected area, then to determine what the footprint is. I mean, so when we don't have landmarks and other areas that were commonly used as geographical markers and landmarks and conditions to figure out where we're at, again, you have this devastation, these debris piles that extend over significant mileages or blocks of areas. Now it becomes even more challenging to try to identify where foundations may have been, the footprint of a particular building, where a starting point may be. So first and foremost, when we talk about first responders, is trying to identify the lay of the land and try to figure out coordinates of where one is located. And then the next step is developing a plan of approach, which is another very lengthy, involving process to grid out the area, then determine the deployment of resources for the most susceptible areas at risk of civilian entrapment and so forth. But each area has uniqueness. So when we talk about these types of conditions across geographical areas, whether we talk about storm surge and water issues and debris materials, whether we talk about water-induced conditions and flooding and mud and debris, which in a mountainous area is entirely different than what we would find in the lowlands or in Florida. And then let's throw in the other aspect where we talk about avalanches with snow. They all create very unique circumstances regarding response, operations, coordination, incident action plans, and everything that's going to affect the deployment and subsequent long-term operations. So they all have very unique conditions. So, even the seismic conditions, we have much more large-scale destruction geographically, but we still have debris piles that may have been a building or a series of buildings that are very much identifiable to some degree because materials are still going to be somewhat present. Floor diaphragms, roof, walls are going to be partially in place. They're not going to see the same degree of destructions as water-induced carried forces, kind of conditions such as that from flooding and from other related aspects. And even wind, let me just throw that in too. Wind conditions will take a building, may lift it because of its buoyancy and construction of materials and drop it somewhere else. But there's normally going to be, once it sets in place, a debris field that's going to extend, that creates a certain degree of consistency and the ability to respond. But as you can tell, our brief conversation here just creates a series of cascading challenges that ultimately the local level first responders should be preparing for. And unfortunately, I think that, we used to say, well, let's plan for that once in a 100-year event. And I think now we're seeing that once in 100 years is certainly being compressed down to something a lot more frequently.
We talk about predictability throughout fires and being able to say that the building is predictable based upon its construction features. When we get into these type of events and how it's being degraded by whatever event, wind, water, mud, earthquake, seismic activity, the predictability begins to go away. We don't have that predictability. And knowing that from being a member of a USAR team at one time and actually deploying into the Asheville area, up in that Weaverville, Asheville area many years ago to a mudslide that pretty much wiped out like a community from the mudslide, and actually, crawling through some of the residential structures and trying to clear those structures and, working with debris piles and, the predictability is how stable was it? Is it potentially going to collapse? And, one of the pieces that I've looked at significantly as, time has gone on, I've had the opportunity to see all the social media posts, all the reels, all the news footage, things that people have shared with me, personally, is that some of these buildings has various degrees of degradation, as I call it, destruction or demolition components by what occurred, especially the flooding. So how do we predict those? I mean, how do we think about operating in those and some of the conditions? And, most of the people that are going to these type of calls don't understand shoring. They don't understand the types of shoring and how you actually shore a building up, whether you're doing T-spots, whether you're doing rakers, whether you're doing box shoring. They don't have that knowledge. And the other part of the fence that really concerns me, Chris, is as we go and we think about the average firefighter, we're sending them out on the streets with probably somewhere around 6 to 8 hours of knowledge of building construction. In other words, they can basically tell you what the components are. And that's what we're doing in Firefighter 1. That's where we see it. We might give a little more in a fire officer program. And if by chance you have the opportunity and you take a college degree course in building construction for a semester or maybe 2 semesters, depending on how that FESI program's set up, then we may be getting, more knowledge to people. But that's the commonality of what they know or what they don't know, which is the scarier part about responding to these incidents and buildings. But no matter what, we're going out the door. We're going to those people's on their sides at the worst days of their life. We're trying to make it better. But again, resulting in a secondary mudslide in North Carolina resulted in a line of duty death. During the hurricane in South Carolina with trees coming down, we sustained 2 line of duty deaths. Georgia sustained a line of duty death. These are very volatile situations that we're going into just because of the instability of these structures and the impact of what these weather events have had. And of course, I've kind of focused on the hurricane a little bit more than other things, but I remember going to building collapses because of the weight of snow, the weight of water sitting on a roof because of the amount of rainfall that we got that when it failed to drain. All these different components that we can get into. So let's focus in on that a little bit. And how do we try to gain some predictability in these structures that have been impacted by these type of events and to make it safe for responders?
Well, I think when you look at it from a national perspective, there's a lot of history behind our responses. So when we take a look at the degree of documentation over decades of time, certainly back into the 20th century, once some things relative to the need for specialized rescue response and the documentation of larger scale responses from environmental impacts became pretty common. There's a lot of lessons and learnings, and those lessons and learnings translated into a variety of different types of documents. I think once we saw the establishment of FEMA and the maturing of technical rescue, and especially the maturing of technical rescue, it actually began as sort of technical rescue, heavy rescue, and then ultimately that developed into the USAR systems as we know them currently. There was a lot of lessons and learnings and sharings looking back at what kind of experiences have we had, what kind of documentation has been made available over those decades. And we fast forward to now into the 2000s, there is a lot of predictability, but that information is embedded in a very specialized curriculum area. In other words, unless you're actively engaged in a special ops team or a USAR task force team, either on a local, regional, or statewide level, it's very unlikely that first responders are going to have access to some of that basic information. So there lies the problem. We don't have enough time or hours to cover all of the fundamentals that one needs to cover. And now we're saying and suggesting, all right, there's additional awareness level training that one needs to have. But that's also a prerequisite. So now that we've recognized that we have vulnerabilities in these varying areas that are now becoming identified across the United States due to this frequency of events, there lies the challenge that we need to find the time and we need to develop the first responders up into an appropriate level of response, of awareness, and then move that up accordingly, especially at the command levels, to have some better insights. And those insights on predictability, of the types of buildings, whether they be modular, fixed, the type 3s, the type 5s, and so forth. It all goes back to, I have certain types of structures that are common to the Myrtle Beach area. I have certain types of structures that are common to the western part of North Carolina, or I go into the Florida area. There's some consistencies that we can look at. We can identify the performance factors based on era and vintage. Do I have these buildings that were built in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, or into the late 1990s, or into the 2000s? There's a lot of predictability, and that information is somewhat available, but it now takes a training division, or it takes a group of individuals on a small or large scale to extract that information, put it into the lesson plans, and get it out into the field to the appropriate units and commanders and those that are going to be responsible for it. So we cannot rely entirely on the overhead teams that are going to come in. There needs to be a reversal of preparation level for first responders. But simply put, the most vulnerable buildings are going to be those buildings that have a degree of that do not have a degree of resiliency. So the modular mobile homes that are not going to be tied down are going to be very vulnerable to wind and or water-related intrusion and or movement. And then obviously in reverse order, when we take a look at wood frame structures, then type 3s that are going to have a little bit more robustness to it. But older buildings are not going to have the types of code and construction features, and more than likely may not have the retrofitting in them to allow them to withstand the impacts by the weather-induced conditions. So, something as simple as, if you talk about water and wind, one is going to move buildings and create very large-scale debris areas. Wind-driven conditions are going to lift and relocate, but there's going to be some semblance or resemblance of structures and materials in that debris field once it touched down, or once that wind ends up dropping and deploying that material. So each one has some very unique characteristics that creates operational challenges and ultimately leads to a very heightened degree of situational awareness. If nothing else, I would really think that our focus from a preparation standpoint would be just to focus in on, how do I maintain a heightened level of situational awareness based upon my surroundings, based upon the given nature of that event, to ensure that at least we're watching over each other. I think common principles of structural firefighting, emergency response are always going to hold true. They're just going to be heightened based upon those circumstances: downed wires, debris, walkway conditions, electrification of areas, hazardous material commodities. There's a lot of different elements, but something as simple as stability of a building. And when there's devastation, and I've got trees and debris and a lot of unstable aspects, some might be more readily identifiable, others may be very, very challenging, which creates another set of eyes that need to be deployed out there, from a safety officer all the way down to the probationary firefighter.
You brought up something that really kind of resonates back to a thought process, and a vision that comes to my mind is the Chimney Rock area. That area had been built for quite some time. Some of the structures were type 5 for sure that we saw, all the residentials, but along the river there were type 5 structures. Some of them were type 3s that you could see. And you saw the devastation that occurred to that area. In fact, pretty much it wiped Chimney Rock completely off the map. If you look at it, the river itself relocated itself. The size of the boulders, when you said the size of rail cars, some folks listening, if you haven't really seen some of the back door pictures of some of this stuff, or been able to see some of the videos, there are honestly boulders and rocks and things that are moved that are the size of rail cars. It actually moved bridges that were much larger than that, and completely just destroyed those, or moved them down and relocated them down the rivers and the streams. And Part of what I'm thinking, Chris, is this: is, you know, more and more, and you said this, the frequency that these things are occurring are becoming more and more frequent. The 100-year floods seem to be coming more like every 10 years at best, if not more and more. The intensity of some of the hurricanes that we've seen that have come in have not been of that magnitude in some time. We haven't seen, that style of a hurricane roll through South Carolina since Hugo. We've had hurricanes that have come through and dumped a lot of water, but just the intensity of what it did is completely different. So my thought goes to training. What do we got to be doing to start preparing our folks that are in the field across the United States for these type of events? Because I don't think that we're not going to see these again. I'm pretty confident we're going to see these again. I'm pretty confident that there's lots and lots and lots of lessons learned. It's kind of like the NIOSH 5. One of the things that I hear frequently is, why doesn't NIOSH tell us something different? Well, when we find something different, we will probably report a little something different. But the NIOSH 5 are the things that show up almost every single time. They're the most common issues that we find in line of duty deaths. So I think in my mind, we've got to start figuring out how to train people to be prepared for certain events like this and how they actually begin being self-sustainable. Because FEMA tells you got 72 hours you need to be self-sustainable before they can get there. And a lot of people were saying, and where's FEMA, where's FEMA, where's FEMA? And I'm thinking, look at all these USAR teams that are there. Look at all these deployed pieces. That's FEMA. It's not the people who are going to sit at a desk or in an office or in a vehicle and try to help you put your life back together initially. It's these people that are deploying in there. And I know that there are many, many, USAR teams that are federal level USAR teams, that were state level USAR teams, that deployed into this large swath of region that extended from Florida through Georgia, through South Carolina to North Carolina to Tennessee, and into Virginia and West Virginia. There were sustained issues of flooding and hurricane, tropical storm type impacts all the way up through and into West Virginia. I know that I was scheduled to be in Whitfield, Virginia, and because of some of the flooding and the impacts that the storm had, we actually canceled that program or rescheduled that program into the spring. But that's a pretty wide swath. So again, now where do we get these resources from, and how well trained are our people to be going out to these type of events? And I think that's something that is on the cusp now that we really need to begin having more and more conversation about, especially at the base firefighter level, because that's who's responding initially. That's the first 72 hours. Those are the folks that are affecting many of these rescues early on. And of course, that's a significant piece, especially because most of these people are seeing their hometown, their family members or friends, the colleagues that they've been around for years are being impacted or, being rescued, or even, the civilian deaths that we saw and still in the search for many, many, many missing people out of North Carolina and in the Tennessee area still.
I think fundamentally we're going to go back to refocusing on some fundamentals that have been around for a long, long period of time. And those fundamentals in terms of preparation and response go back to earthquake-related responses, large-scale devastation, and these all were fundamental to the establishment of preparation, both in terms of first responders and, more importantly, utilizing community resources. So when we take a look at what was fundamental based upon the major earthquakes that were occurring back in the 1970s, late the 60s and the 70s in the state of California, or certainly throughout the western states from earthquake-related responses. the initiation and the development of the CERT teams, community emergency response teams, and resources was fundamental, because again, we were talking about 72 to 96 or greater amount of hours before the availability. This is pre task force era days, but the availability of local responders to be able to initiate actions due to large scale devastation. So that was fundamental as a major emergency response and emergency planning criteria. I think the state of Florida took that and embraced it, both based on two major events, both Hurricane Hugo and Hurricane Andrew. So when we take a look at those two initiating events, and again, we talk about the need for resources and training and awareness, that was a major focal point for elevating emergency responders and community-based resources through the state of Florida and into some of the other maybe adjoining states that might have had some related issues. And I think back upon, again, some things that came about as a result of the issues affecting Louisiana and New Orleans and such too. So let's fast forward again. I think fundamentally somehow the conversation needs to be brought back in a focal point about community resources, community response teams, awareness level training for first responders. The information's out there. The ability to focus in on some of these key types of responses that are going to be regionally based. So I'm not going to be concerned about avalanche response in the north, in the southeast, but I am going to be concerned about two different aspects: wind-induced conditions, and guess what, flooding-related responses, and then focus in on the building types, the predictability aspects, the training aspects, the situation awareness. We can develop that awareness level, but I think the missing element here, Doug, is going to be possibly refocusing in on developing capabilities for the communities to be self-sustainable for a period of time until those federal resources, state and federal resources, are able to deploy to provide that higher level of expertise, expert deployability, the resources, the equipment, personnel, and so forth. There's a lot that can be done in those early phases on the local level. So the state of Florida did an exceptional job post major events in the last 25 years. And I think other communities are going to have to revisit that. I think the entire emergency planning community is going to take a step back to take a look at what we need to refocus in upon, what needs to be developed and initiated, reinitiated. It's not like we're reinventing the wheel. Those components and resources have been there for a long period of time, but I think that they were taken off of the front burner and even taken off the stove altogether. They were just completely maybe put back into the cupboard, because we have not been talking about these types of conversations in a long, long period of time. But we have seen the series of events across the United States, certainly over the last, let's say, 10 years, or certainly the immediacy of the last 5 years, being present and again, impacting a lot of different communities, all the way from the flooding to the seismic conditions, to the wildland fires that in themselves cause mudslides and other related events, wind-driven conditions, snow conditions, the hurricanes and the tornadoes and everything else. So these are great conversations. I think that us just being able to bring that back into the forefront is a critical element just to provide refocusing. Hey, this is the attention we need to do, and hopefully put that back into the appropriate special interest groups and our professional organizations. But certainly, I think a lot of this rests on the emergency planning community to assess, take a look at the lessons, and then work in conjunction with federal and state resources to figure out what needs to be done, and then move that conversation along. It should not be once and done. I think the continuing ongoing issues with the Carolinas in particular, I mean, Florida has certainly come further along in the recovery, but again, if anybody's paying attention, especially coming out of the election cycle and so forth, there's still a lot of major issues affecting a sizable population in the North Carolina area that certainly has not been receiving the necessary type of media coverage that it should. we're seeing numbers. I mean, I see them all the time. Each day I see the numbers change in terms of what the current accurate head count may be for losses of life, but there's absolutely nothing that's being promoted, certainly on the national level, that I've seen across the various media platforms, that is really showing what's going on in those particular areas in terms of recovery and many of the other issues. So sizable challenges, certainly sizable challenges.
And definitely that is a big piece. And of course, when you're in a community and you're part of emergency response and you lose your resources and your infrastructure to be able to even respond, which we did see that in multiple places throughout Georgia and some of South Carolina, a major component in North Carolina and Tennessee. I mean, it was just like the evacuation of the hospital, critical infrastructure, staff, workers, patients on the roof. You see ambulances and fire apparatus that are submerged in water, aeromedical evacuations of rescues going off the roof and boat systems. And, that's something that, again, expertise, what are we doing to train our folks? And again, I don't disagree with you at all. I think a lot of this stuff is available, to help make more sustainability in our communities. But I think we got to go back and revisit what we're doing with the responders. And again, it's somewhat predictable. History does repeat itself over time. It's probably been a long time since we saw that impact, since about the 1980s, when Hurricane Hugo actually hit all the way up into West Virginia as a Category 1 hurricane, creating a lot of wind damage, a lot of water, flooding type events. It was a fairly fast moving storm, so the amount of water that was falling was a little different than what we saw in the most recent one with Helene. The thing that is I'm seeing even more and more, Chris, is that we're getting these quote unquote perfect storms kind of created, because in upstate South Carolina, North Carolina, they had seen a significant amount of rain in front of the hurricane. And in fact, we were coming out of the South Carolina Chiefs Conference. It was coming into the last day, and there were fire chiefs from the upstate that were, upstaffing. They were doing things because of this particular storm in front of the storm. Was creating some issues for them with downed trees, road blockages, some flooding. They were beginning to see that. And then all of a sudden, as the hurricane approached, it embedded this other storm within it. And, you think about it, it's pretty unprecedented to see 25, 27, up to 30 inches of rain in an area. That's a lot of water. And, I would like to know, when you start talking about that amount of water, how many gallons of water fell in that area. One of the hydrologists here during one of the hurricanes actually predicted the amount of gallons, based upon, formatic, calculations that you can do that they understand. And of course, they were very great in their predictions and were always spot on. These folks that come in that do that, especially with USAR teams, are phenomenal with their abilities. But the astonishing number of gallons of water that was present or potentially fell in that area was impactful. But again, we go back to things that we don't train firefighters in, that they're going to be going out. That's when firefighter 1.
Just the water. I mean, just water alone. And you make a great point there, Doug. It's not the major hurricanes and tornadoes. I think commonality, when we take a look at one of the most significant or underestimated operational challenges, both in terms of life safety and response, are the weather-induced conditions dealing with rain. And it does not take an awful lot of rain to almost paralyze us in terms of response. You can't get apparatus on the roads when we have flooding. Even the most robust of apparatus can be affected in terms of mobility and maneuverability based upon a minimal amount of water that is being placed into street areas and basins and so forth. So flooding conditions, the impact of sustainability of life, individuals that are being trapped because of fast rising water conditions, even in urban areas. So aside from what's occurring in some of the geographical areas that, we talk about riverways and watershed locations and so forth, and tree lines and such, we have major metropolitan areas that become impacted by significant torrential rainstorms in very short periods of time that create catastrophic flooding that paralyzes the entire city, even to the point of knocking out transformers, transportation systems, inundation of numerous occupancy types, both residential, multiple occupancies, commercials, disruption of travel capabilities. I mean, it is major when we talk about something as simple as a rainstorm. So that, I think, is something that you just touched upon that we're not having anywhere near enough of the conversation on, but it is a commonality, whether we talk about, especially from the kinds of occurrences that are occurring in the western states. But take a look at the Metroplex. You take a look at Houston and Dallas. You take a look at what's occurring up into the Mississippi Valley area, into the Tennessee location, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, into the upper areas of the Virginias and so forth, and all the way up into the Northeast. I mean, it is a common occurrence with major ramifications that create some very, very challenging conditions that, again, the buoyancy of buildings can be carried away by flooding waters. The waters recede. We've got, a variety of different operational concerns, but water-related issues, the introduction of wildlife and gators and snakes and other things. I mean, there's a lot of different moving parts of all of this that creates a very, very specialized area for conversation, discussion, preparation, training, and so forth. But out of all of them, I think what we see here that's common, 365 days, potentially 365 during the year, is rain and wind-induced conditions. That doesn't take a tornado, doesn't take a hurricane, but I can have some rather substantial sustainable winds coupled with torrential rainstorms that may become the new normal for our challenging responses. And then we talk about building conditions and other aspects and so forth that create another conversation.
Well, I'm hoping that that's getting some folks thinking out there as far as what they need to be doing for their training programs within their department, even what needs to potentially be occurring, maybe from a curriculum level, from an NFPA level. And I know that in some of the standards, the 1010 standard, when they're starting to combine some things that are in there, but again. And I think about this, and this is a conversation that's going to come up, and I know it's going to come up, and I know people are thinking this already, is that it's hard enough to get volunteers trained to the level we're trying to get them trained to now. But, how do we keep adding? How do we keep putting things on there? But I think the conversation and the realism needs to come up is that our environments that we're working in today, unfortunately, have changed. And we're seeing things that we haven't ever seen before. We're seeing, the frequency of these events occurring at astonishing rates that we've never seen before. The tornadoes that are occurring, the length of time that tornadic activity is occurring on the ground, the impact, the size, the swath. We're seeing so many things that are occurring across the United States. And again, it's not just hurricanes, it's not just floods, it's tornadoes, it's rainstorms, it's snowstorms, it's avalanches, it's mudslides, everything that is going, and as population continues to increase within the United States, the more buildings that are required, to house these people. And we're running across that. That's one of the pieces here that constantly stays in my mind, with our growth factor of 33 new people a day moving into our county here in Erie County, and the number of building permits that are open, and the types of structures that are going up. And, most of those are the modern engineered system style houses that are going up, how does that impact what we're dealing with on a daily basis when it comes to weather events? And I think this is a conversation that needs to be probably had more frequently now, maybe analyzed a little different than what we've analyzed it before. But I think the realism is there that we're in an evolving time, and that change is necessary. It's intimate that we're going to have to do this. But exactly what do we have to do? And I think that's the conversation we need to be getting to is how do we change?
I would be remiss, we talk about training and some of the resources. I would encourage our listeners, if they're not familiar with the NFPA 1670 standard on technical rescue, embedded within that document are a number of the things that we talked about in terms of response and tiered level training, all the way from the awareness level up to technical levels of operation in a variety of different capacities and in a variety of different response modes. So whether it be water related, confined space, technical, collapse related, there is some documentation that can be accessed to at least be aware of some standardized approaches that have been in place for a number of decades. Those standards were promulgated in the late 1980s. I did have the opportunity to work on the original 1470 standard, and then ultimately in the development of the 1670 standard that, again, set things into motion all the way from edition 1 back in the early 1990s. But there's some other resources at FEMA. You go to the FEMA website, work with the emergency planning organizations, both regionally and at the state level, to identify some of those links. FEMA has a robust availability of resources. Again, although the USAR teams are set up nationally, they're typically, again, state-based. All of this is accessible. So all of the training documents, the literature, curriculums, and so forth are accessible and downloadable. So if you're looking to identify between the standards and other resources, some things that you might be able to just do a stepped level of increase in your own organization on your own, go at it, because that stuff is there. Just find the time, the resources are available, and you're not going to have to operate blindly or have to start from ground zero to build up a system. So,
well, great conversation tonight, Chris. I think it's important we have these conversations, and it's timely for one, but also I think it's a needed conversation. So, final thoughts before we close out the show.
I think, our continued thoughts and prayers to all of our first responders and the communities that more recently have been impacted by the devastation of the most recent occurrences, those that are still trying to recover from the past events that, again, are sort of coming back on top of each other, and certainly and in anticipation of those events that are forthcoming, that we just need to prepare for. We need to have resiliency. We need to have the right skill set level. I think we've all got determination. Our communities, our first responders all want to do the right thing, but just maintain, if nothing else, maintain a heightened level of situational awareness in those circumstances that you are being confronted with. Rely on your training, look out for each other, and identify those best practices to strengthen and continue to be able to respond to serve your community. So, Doug, I think our conversation tonight was very, very timely in a variety of different ways. And I think, again, as just kudos to your program, your podcast, and to Fire Engineering for allowing us to have this brief conversation that hopefully will resonate with those that are listening in on the program. So thanks again.
Well, in my closing thoughts, I echo what you said, Chris. Many people and friends from my days back in North Carolina are still again, trying to recover. Friends in Tennessee that were impacted and from that area, still struggling quite a bit. We still have a very robust system of support that's going in there, and I applaud the efforts of everyone that's engaged with that and everybody that's supporting that. Again, part of what fire and training is really all about is talking about what we need to be doing, taking a kind of a totality look. In other words, the window to the wider world look of issues and, challenges that we are facing and how do we overcome that? Because we're really dedicated to, making sure that we provide the best that we can provide to people in the field, making sure they're getting good information, good knowledge. And, our whole goal with this is everyone goes home. And I would be remiss if I didn't point out that, many years ago at Tampa 1, when we talked about preventing line of duty deaths and the 16 life safety initiatives, we were well over 100 line of duty deaths a year. And we had a goal of reducing that by 50% in 10 years. Well, it's taken us a little longer than 10 years. We're sitting at 52 line of duty deaths right now for 2024. That was the last number I saw, unless something has occurred that I haven't, received any information on, which is honestly, it's refreshing to see that the numbers have gone down, even with some of the catastrophic events that have occurred across the United States this year. And our hearts and our thoughts go out to those 4 families that are dealing with line of duty deaths from Hurricane Helene. Very tragic situation. I attended both the events in South Carolina for that. But again, I'm very pleased to see that the 16 life safety initiatives seem to be taking a good hold. We're making great progress in that. Again, there's always room for improvement in everything we do, and in that strive for the excellence that we have across the United States and in the fire and emergency services. So, Chris, thank you for joining the show. Thank you for the insights that you provided and the expertise that you always provide when it comes to the built environment. To our listeners, thank you for tuning in to another edition of Fire and Training. I'm your host, Douglas Cline, and we look forward to seeing you on a future Fire and Training show. Till then, stay safe, train hard, and we'll see you on the next show.
In the world of firefighting and public safety, reliability is key. That's why for over 2 decades, first responders nationwide have trusted TheFireStore as their go-to source for essential equipment, apparel, and accessories. Visit TheFireStore.com online or in-store today.
For all your medication and narcotic tracking needs, check out the LogRX app, created by career fire and EMS professionals. That's LogRX.com.
This podcast is brought to you by Flex 7 from TenCate Protective Fabrics. Flexible, comfortable, and powered with the strength of enforced technology. Flex 7 outer shell fabric is made to move. To learn more, visit TenCateFabrics.com